Well, welcome. We talked about diving the other day. Tonight and tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about drowning. And remember, you can also have a diving accident that can cause you to drown. Just to let you know that we estimate that there's about 500,000 deaths per year. The problem is we do not really know how many people die of drowning. Back in 2005, they figured there was an average of 10 drownings each day. An additional 710 died from drowning and other causes, such as boating accidents. Sometimes what happens is it doesn't get reported as a drowning, and so it causes us some problems trying to figure out exactly what's going on. If you look at this, it's the leading cause of death in children ages 1 through 14. Remember, we're coming into the season now where we're starting to see the 5-gallon buckets out, and unfortunately, we leave them out, and these young children fall into them. They're very top heavy, and they can't get out. It's the leading cause of death of 5 to 14-year-old males, and the fifth leading cause for death for females, except in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where it is the leading cause for females, okay? Basically, it's the third leading cause of accidental death in the U.S. Children that require CPR when arriving at the ED have a very poor prognosis. About half of them will survive, and about half of those will have significant neurological impairment. 19% of drowning deaths involve children in public pools where there was actually a lifeguard on present at that particular point. And so sometimes you can miss those things, especially if you're not quite sure what you're looking at. So there it is. One of the things that we see estimated for each fatal drowning, there's at least 5 non-fatal hospitalization submersions. Drowning accounts for almost 13,000 ED visits every year. The problems we see can be permanent loss of basic functions, memory problems, learning problems, persistent vegetative states. Sometimes with your non-fatal drownings, you can just end up with a mild cough to severe pulmonary edema. You can have very mild symptoms all the way up to neurological impairment, okay? And as I said, we have more non-fatal drownings than we do fatal drownings. And so a lot of these children survive. The question is what is their long-term life going to be like at that particular point in time? So the World Health Organization decided, we got to figure out what's going on here. And they did a study, and one of the things they studied was the cost impact of drowning. And what they came up with is in the USA, 45% of drowning deaths are among the most economically active segment of the population. Coastal drowning in the USA alone accounts for somewhere around $273 million each year in direct and indirect causes. So where can drowning occur? It can occur anywhere: swimming pools, rivers, lakes, oceans, toilets, 5-gallon buckets, puddles that are only 4 or 5 inches deep. It can happen. And remember, we see drowning almost year round, especially so in the summer months, okay? So they decided we need a better definition of drowning. This is your World Conference on Drowning. Everybody was saying this is drowning. You have wet drowning, you have dry drowning, you have near drowning, actual death drowning, and nobody could ever tell you what all of those different things meant. So the other thing they wanted to be able to do was try to find out, how many people are actually drowning if we put all of this data together. So what they basically changed it to is what you see here. It's a process resulting in primary respiratory impairment in a liquid medium, okay? And the outcome can either be delayed morbidity or death or life without morbidity, okay? So it's one of those things depending on what happens to the patient. And so what we did is we took all of those terms and we said, they're gone. They don't exist anymore. Drowning is drowning. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit and use some of those terms today just to give you an idea of how they relate back to what is drowning, okay? One of the things that we see if you watch movies, if you watch programs, people who are drowning, they're, waving their arms in the air, help me, help me. It used to be said if they didn't go up and down 3 times, they weren't drowning. The problem is drowning doesn't look like this, and people who are drowning are not going to go up and down in the water 3 times to let you know that they're drowning, okay? This is just a kind of an interesting picture. If you had a longer time to stare at it, what you would see is that that child would disappear. And one of the things I mentioned is sometimes when people are drowning, we don't know that they have drowned. Parents will go looking for their children. Adults will go looking for their significant others and they don't know where they are. And then finally somebody will get in the pool. They'll start to walk around the bottom of the pool. They'll kick something. And when they kick something, that's the body at that particular point in time. So not all drowning victims are found fairly close to when they happen. Sometimes there is a delay. So there it is, as we said, it's submersion in the liquid, but it doesn't always have to be water, okay? If you don't interrupt it, you're going to die. If you do interrupt it, you still can die. Or you can just have some neurological deficits, or you may not have any deficits at all, okay? Originally, we thought you died of asphyxia. Then we said, no, not really. Cardiac arrhythmia, electrolyte disturbance is probably really what's going on at this point because there's a lot of water that enters the systemic system, or there's not a lot of water entering the systemic system, but it's staying in the lungs. And now what we know is that the significant physiological consequence is hypoxemia and severe cerebral anoxia. So what do we see when what do we see when victims drown? Basically, what you see is the first 2 different categories. The first one is interfering or stopping breathing, resulting in damage to the brain, the lungs, the heart, the nervous system. Unfortunately, the other category is death. So what do we see when a person is drowning? Well, one of the things that we have to be careful of is chemical pneumonitis, okay? You see this with the oceans. The oceans, unfortunately, are fairly polluted. And if you get into the ocean or even pool water that's polluted, one of the things we have to watch out for is chemical pneumonitis. It can also be caused by the chemicals you put in your pools, so you have to be aware of that. It's going to damage the cells lining the alveoli. You're going to end up with some atelectasis at that particular point. You're going to end up with some intrapulmonary shunting. When you have intrapulmonary shunting, there's no gas exchange going on or very little gas exchange going on. And as that result of that, combined with the atelectasis, now you have some very stiff, non-compliant lungs, and this will send you into respiratory failure. Other things we see with this is respiratory acidosis with hypercapnia. You also have metabolic acidosis. If you're hypoxic, you're going to end up with metabolic issues. Remember, in order to produce ATP and not produce all the lactic acid, you have to have oxygen. So if you don't have oxygen, you're going to have lactic acid. With that lactic acid, we're going to see the metabolic acidosis. You're going to see hypoxia, both pulmonary and cerebral edema. You're also going to see non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema, okay? And this can also coexist with the atelectasis. We do have changes in your EKG rhythms. They can be a cause of what's going on with you. A lot of times, though, the changes in the electrolytes are not one of the major significant causes, but it can be if, depending on the type of water you're in some cases. So diving terms that we no longer use simply because we didn't really know how to define them. And I think this pretty well shows up when you look under near drowning, okay? Near drowning basically meant you survived for 24 hours and then you drop dead, okay? But before 2002, there were 13 published definitions. What is the definition of near drowning? Depended on what you were using. Now, what we look at is, did the patient die, or the victim die or survive? Did they die immediately? It doesn't really matter. Did they die after 24 hours? Doesn't matter. They fall into that category of death. Another category then is, did they survive? If the answer is survive is yes, then we need to look, do they have any morbidity? If they do, what is that morbidity? Or did they actually survive without any morbidity at that particular point? Secondary drowning also meant that you had complications from a submersion event, and this primarily was pulmonary edema. You also then would survive for about 24 hours, and then after 24 hours, and you would die from the pulmonary edema and what other injuries were caused to you. Immersion syndrome was kind of cool. It's a sudden death due to cardiac arrest after sudden cold and water submersion. You guys know on January 1st, back on the East Coast, they have the Polar Bear Club where all these people go into the freezing water and they do their initiation, and everything's supposed to be really hunky-dory and that you shouldn't have problems with it. Well, when I was working, we had this gentleman who came into the ED fairly young. He was in his 30s, and he had decided to go up to Mount Lemmon, but he stopped at Rose Canyon Lake and decided he was going to join the Polar Bear Club. And as a result of what he did, he actually suffered a heart attack. He survived his heart attack. However, that brought with it a lot of other complications, insurance issues and things along that line. Okay. And why does this happen? As you can see, it's a result of your vagal response. And then the submersion injury could be any of the above at that particular point. So in dry drowning, we used to have that, and wet drowning. And wet drowning, water was in the lungs. It accounts for like 85 to 95% of your drownings. Dry drowning, what happened is you had a mucus plug. What happened with the mucus plug, you basically had a sudden laryngeal spasm from the vagus response at that particular point. 10 to 15% of the drownings. And they would, when they did autopsies, they would find this plug at that particular point. And so then the question comes up, well, how do you take care of these folks? Well, here's the thing about it, is that we don't do much difference. Okay, whatever we do for dry drowning, if you survive it, or wet drowning, if you survive it, it's going to be about basically the same. So the two different water types you have are salt water and fresh water. The pathophysiologic differences in experimental models showed us what happened to the body in these two cases, and we're going to talk about those. However, as you can see, we still manage them basically the same. The end result, the type of water aspirated, has very little significance on your survival. There's a lot of things we're going to talk about that helps us survive these. Fresh water, for the most part, water enters the lungs. When water enters the lungs, it denatures the pulmonary surfactant as a result of having a lot of water in the lungs at that particular point, and as a result of that, it passes into systemic circulation. Once it gets into systemic circulation, what's going to happen is you increase your blood volume, and then you end up with hemolysis. Guys remember probably from first semester, when you talked about red blood cells, what happens to them, and you put them in a lot of fresh water or water, period, they expand and then they swell and then they rupture at that particular point. So you also, in the lungs, as a result of this, are going to end up with some atelectasis, and there's your interpulmonary shunting. You do have that electrolyte imbalance at that particular point, and then you're going to end up with a large VQ mismatch, and then you can die from ventricular fibrillation. It looks those little question marks there really aren't question marks. That actually happens to be the fonts. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about that. Okay. Salt water, hypertonic solution in the alveoli. Remember, when it's hypertonic, water follows salt. So where's the water going, or where's it coming from? It's going to come from systemic circulation and end up in the lungs. You still remove the surfactants. You still have some pulmonary edema at this particular point. You do have some changes in your sodium and your chloride. As I said, it doesn't really cause a lot of problems. This was an experiment. If you look at this, they instilled 22 mLs per kilogram of salt water in an airway, and then they drained it. And what they did is they drained 33 mLs per kilo after 5 minutes, okay? And unfortunately, these people from the actually, I think it was done on dogs, which I don't approve of, but that's me, actually ended up with pulmonary edema. Okay, so you gotta watch that. What happens with this too? Now you have serious hypoxemia as a result of having all that fluid in your lungs. There's no place for gas exchange to take place at that point. How long does it take to drown? Basically, they'll tell you it's somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes, whether it's fresh water or salt water. So there it is. In either fresh or salt water, you have fluid in the lungs, you lose the surfactant, you have an alteration of your permeability within the alveolar capillary area, so you have decreased lung compliance, you have a lot of shunting, VQ mismatches going on, and the duration of submersion is the best predictor of death at this point. As you can see, cerebral hypoxia causes both morbidity and death. And how do we treat this? We have to do ventilation, oxygenation, and compressions. Try to get to you as soon as we can. So how do you die? For the first thing, it's a period of panic and hyperventilation. However, you're not going to be, moving those arms and going, help me, help me, help me. Matter of fact, you're just going to be sitting there and the water is basically going to come up to your mouth and you're just going to try to continue paddle to keep and push the water down to keep it out of your lungs at that particular point, okay? Basically what you do is you attempt to hold your breath. However, remember when CO2 elevates, you've got to blow it off, okay? So that you're going to have an increased respiratory rate at that particular point, okay? The other thing is because you're panicking, you're trying to move that water, you're going to start using a lot of your oxygen. And remember now at this particular point, we're having a problem with oxygen because we can't get it into the lungs, we can't get it into the body, okay? And so unfortunately what happens then, you now have large volumes of water that's being aspirated into the lungs. And basically, loss of consciousness can begin within about 3 minutes of being under the water. And basically, people are going to try to, again, hold their breath. But unfortunately, once you reach about 55 millimeters of mercury of CO2, you've lost the control and you're going to start hyperventilating. As the drowning event continues, the person cannot keep their airway cleared. They're trying to spit out this water because, like I said, they're about mouth level. Within about seconds to minutes, the airway can't be kept cleared. And what's going to happen then is they're going to stimulate their cough reflex. They're going to start coughing. When you start coughing, if you inhale, you're going to inhale this water. Laryngeal spasm is rare. Remember, it happens with your dry drowning that we no longer call dry drowning. However, it wouldn't matter because it really doesn't protect the airway unless it's a full mucus plug that you develop. Okay. So there it is. Gasping for air continues until you can no longer breathe. You lose consciousness at this point. Water now is going to passively enter into the airway. Aspiration continues. Here's where your hypoxemia comes into it. You lose consciousness, apnea within seconds to minutes, and then you'll end up with cardiac arrest. And the victim will lose consciousness when the O2 is about 25 to 30 millimeters of mercury. If you remember, we talked about the hypoxic drive. We said that the hypoxic drive starts about 30 millimeters of mercury and is very strong. It stimulates up to 60 millimeters of mercury and then it slows down. So in a drowning victim, it's less than 30, so you've lost that drive to breathe at that particular point. What you're going to do then too is you're going to try to save these people. And one of the things you do is you're going to start CPR. You start in the water. So sometimes you end up with tachycardia that then leads to bradycardia, and then you're going to end up with PEA, which ends up in diastole, and then hypoxemic cardiac arrest. Okay, there are rare cases where people survive much longer. A lot of these are due to cold water, because we're going to talk a little bit about the mammalian diving reflex and see what happens with that. Okay. And then cardiac arrest is the result of the hypoxemia. It does insult not ventricular dysrhythmias, okay? So this is the drowning chain of survival. This is part of what you're going to do today for your assignment. It shows you the different things that hopefully could prevent drowning at this particular point. Unfortunately, if you unable to do all of them, you're not going to do anything to help that person. Right. So how do you survive? Well, here's the number one thing: prevention. Teach whoever you have to swim. If you're going to go boating, make sure you're wearing life jackets, okay? If you don't know anything about the area where you're going to go swim, find out about it. Because a lot of times people don't realize there's the undercurrents and they'll tow you out. People will get on, these rafts, they'll fall asleep. The current will come in, take them out. They wake up, they're in the middle of the ocean. No longer can they see land. So the things that you need to do is make sure that you practice prevention, okay? So the key factors that affect the chance of survival without permanent injury: how long were you down there? The shorter the period of time, the better it is. The water temperature: the colder the water, the better the chances. The victim's age, because children have a better diving reflex. Why do children have a better diving reflex? We can freeze them a lot quicker. Okay, so if the water is cold and they start aspirating this cold water, they can go ahead and slow everything down much, much quicker than an adult can. And then the speed of resuscitation. And the key to resuscitation is not bringing the patient or the victim to the equipment, it's bringing the equipment to the patient, okay? So as you see off to the side, the age, the younger the better, the shorter, the colder. CPR, if appropriately applied, is better. You're going to start breathing for these patients while they're in the water, okay? The water quality, the cleaner the better. You don't want them struggling, because struggling uses up that oxygen that they're not going to have. The other thing you need to remember is if you're going to go save somebody and they're struggling in the water, you need to approach them from the rear, or you need to bring a baseball bat with you. And people go, "That's not funny." Well, here's the thing about it is, if you approach them from the front and they're struggling, they're going to drown you, because they're going to climb on you, hoping to stay out of the water and get better. So you need to make sure that you protect yourself, because otherwise you're not going to be able to protect that person either, okay? And then the other things that you need to watch is what happened at this particular point. One of the things I'll tell you, if you own a boat, if you're going to start the boat, let the engineer out for about 5 minutes and then you can do it. People who haven't done this have blown these boats up. And as a result of that, people have ended up in the water, and sometimes with all their injuries, they ended up drowning, okay? So you got to know what else is going on at that particular point. So ER studies have shown that drowning victims are likely to have a poor outcome if you look at this. And this is the other side of what we just talked about. And one of the things that you see is if their core temperature is fallen below 33 degrees Celsius, it's sometimes very hard to get them back, but it's also very protective. The longest that I've heard about was this boy in Minnesota who fell into the water. He was in there for 66 minutes. They rescued him. They, warmed him up, did everything they needed to, and he had no morbidities, and he did extremely well. That doesn't happen with everyone, but it did with him. The Glasgow Coma Scale, we'll talk a little bit about that. If it's 5 or lower, normally if it's 8 or lower, you're in a coma and you're going to be ventilated or at least bagged, because you're not going to be doing much on your own. If you're younger than 3 is another one. If you have persistent apnea or need frequent CPR in the ED, okay? Some of these folks, when they come in, they're talking to you. They can tell you what's happening, they can tell you what's going on, and then they stop breathing, and then you do CPR, and then they come back, and they start talking again, and maybe 20 minutes later or so, then they go ahead and they stop breathing again. So you have to watch these folks, because if this continues, there's a good chance that they're not going to make it, okay? If the arterial blood pH is less than 7.1, you're extremely acidotic. And remember, acidotic is not good, because it is an insult to the system. So what do we have to do? We have to correct your hypoxemia. We have to correct your acidosis. We have to prevent pulmonary cerebral edema. We got to do something. Do we need to correct your electrolytes somewhere down the line? Yes, we do. Okay. In water resuscitation, we do breathing. It provides 3.15 times a better chance of surviving, okay? Don't attempt, when you get to land, don't attempt to drain fluid. Don't do the Heimlich. You know, you may have seen that somewhere. Hey, lay them on their stomach, pull their arms back, see if you can cough, have them cough and spit the water out. You know, whatever it is, please don't do that. It increases vomiting, and you don't want to do that because now you're aspirating more material into the lungs. And if you look, it says a small but significant mortality from this, about 19%. To me, 19% is a little bit more than small, okay? And then the last thing is bring the equipment to the victim. Don't bring the victim to the equipment. So what do? Begin breathing in water. No heartbeat or carotid pulse. Begin CPR on the solid surface. Intubate if you need to. Don't be sitting there trying to decide if you need to or not. Eventually, you're going to have mechanical ventilation for oxygenation. Defibrillate or cardiovert for arrhythmias, okay, if they're not stopping. Now, one of the things you need to know too is if these patients are really, really cold, we're going to shock them if they're in VFib or pulses VTAC. It may not work, and we know that. However, it may do something for us, okay? So just be aware of that that's something that can happen. If you have a suspected diving injury, you know, put your neck in a neutral position, use your jaw thrust without the head tilt chin lift for rescue breathing. Remember though, if you cannot open the airway with the jaw thrust, even if you suspect a neck injury, you still can use the head tilt chin lift, okay? And then if they're breathing, give them some oxygen. Now, a lot of times folks will come out and they'll tell you, I'm okay, I'm all right, you know, I'm breathing. Look at, you know, little oxygen, I look really good, don't I? Where we see the problem is within about 7 hours after the event, they're going to end up going down, okay? And that's one of the reasons why we want to take them to the hospital, because we know something like that's going to happen. You can read stories on the folks who have done this. A couple of years ago, there was a story of this 10-year-old in South Carolina, had a near drowning type event. Mom took him home, gave him a bath, was going to feed him dinner. He wasn't hungry. He went to bed. She went and checked on him a little bit later, and he was dead. Okay, so we need to talk to these folks and tell them that you need to be in the hospital, because within about 7 hours, we're going to see something. We're going to continue resuscitation as we take you in. It's may take several hours for us to start to see the pulmonary insult at that particular point. The key, just because you're conscious doesn't mean that you're going to recover from this, okay? In the hospital, we need to look at your acid-base balances, continuous mechanical vent for you, make sure that we're ventilating you appropriately, and then we may have to give you some bicarb, even if your alveolar ventilation is adequate, because we have to take care of that metabolic acidosis at that particular point. So what are we looking at for ABG monitoring? There's your oxygenation, acid-base balance. There's a formula that determines how much bicarb we need to give you. You'll hear it. You can find it in Philbean's book when you get that in 5th semester. You'll get it in 4th semester, but in 5th semester, and it tells you about how much we want to give it at that point. And we're going to use high FiO2s until we show that that PaO2 is starting to increase. You may need to bag these folks. You may put them on a vent and it's not working, and you may need to pull them off and then go ahead and bag them with maybe a little bit more force that we would use otherwise. But you have to be careful with that too. Beta agonist, we can go ahead and give those down the tube if they're intubated, and we'll bag them into the patient. If you have fluid aspiration and you end up with aspiration pneumonitis, corticosteroids for the inflammation and antibiotics. Corticosteroids are kind of interesting because when we get into the trauma portion of this, a lot of times we're really reluctant to give the corticosteroids because of the secondary infections that can come from them. So you have to be really, really careful, and you really have to monitor these patients. ARDS is a major byproduct of all of this, and as a result of that, we need mechanical ventilation and PEEP because we need to keep those airways open. Your pulmonary care can last for hours or days. We can correct your fluid and electrolyte imbalances. We need to watch your blood pressure, so you may need some volume expanders. People are going to probably tell you if they don't understand it, oh my gosh, they just aspirated half of the Pacific Ocean. Why are you giving them fluids? Well, the half of the Pacific Ocean they aspirated has nothing in it that's going to help them. It's going to hurt them. And so what we need to do is we're going to go ahead and try to get rid of that. And we need to give you some good fluid to help you with your red blood cells and help you with what else is going on at that particular point. Okay? And in some cases, as you can see, you may need red blood cells, and you also may have some other things going with it. Forced diuresis, okay, we can do that also. And there's your hyperventilation or hyperoxygenation. They've tried this in the hyperbaric chamber, however, it does carry some risk, so we're really not quite sure if that's something that we want to do. The bottom line of all of this, if you want to look at it, is we don't have any one single thing that we can do that's going to benefit a patient after they've had a global brain ischemia, okay? The only thing they could hope for is if we're doing brain transplants, that perhaps they could get one of those. And so what are we going to do? The primary goal of treatment in the ICU, prevent further damage to the neurological system, make sure that they get some oxygen, take care of that acid-base balance, get some fluid on board that you need to, and try to hope that we don't end up with secondary conditions like seizures and coma. So cold water survival, we're not really sure why it works, but we know it does in kids from time to time. And it's called your mammalian dive-in reflex, okay? It basically cools you fairly quickly. It shunts the blood into the center and the core of the body, to the heart, the brain, and the lungs. The periphery, we're not worried about that. You can eventually get that back, but you don't need it at this particular point in time. When we shunt you and we make you nice and cold, your need for oxygen decreases. And as a result of that, that's one of those things that helps keep you alive. So what are some of the requirements? The water has to be colder than 5 degrees centigrade. Core body temperature somewhere 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. Body temperature has to go fast. That's why kids do much better at this than we do. And as we go, as I mentioned, we don't really know why it works, but it does. So here's some keys. Resuscitation has to be attempted even if you've been in the water for an hour or more. We need to get your hypothermia corrected if we can. We need to start warming you up. And we know that the heart's going to be less responsive. However, if you're in VTAC or pulsus VTAC or VFib, we're still going to try to shock you to put you back in a rhythm. So this are some of the hypothermic effects, mild hypothermia. You have your increased O2 demand, your temperature somewhere between 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, moderate at that particular point, less than 32 degrees, O2 use and cerebral perfusion is decreased. You have a risk of asystole or VFib at this particular point in time. We also know, and this happens when people go out in camp or whatever in the wintertime, if they're hypothermic, once their body temperature gets much, much lower than 32 degrees, we'll sometimes find them without any clothes or anything else on. And if they did survive, they would tell you they got very hot. And you kind of wonder, how did you get hot when your body was so cold? It's just a reflex as far as that goes. And one of you guys wrote a really good article on the diving, to where this has happened to some divers who suffered from nitrogen narcosis and weren't able to get out of the water. They were found without their clothes. They were also found out without any of their equipment at that particular point in time. So here it is. Basically, about 75% of drowning victims who receive medical treatment will survive. About 6% will be left with long-term neurological problems. And unfortunately, we're still trying to get better at this and hopefully increase it. So what do we do again? Education, education, education. Make sure your children know how to swim. Make sure if they don't know how to swim that you keep an eye on them and keep them away from the water, okay? How many times have people been at the beach or something and they have 2 or 3 kids and the little one doesn't know how to swim or anything? Mom turns around or dad turns around or both of them do because something else happened, and all of a sudden when they turn back around, the child is not there, and they will sometimes find the body floating in the water. There's new rules for fencing around swimming pools. If you're building a home, you've got to have better fencing, better locks. There's still places out there, though, where the kids can climb up on the fence and they can open it up and they can get into it. We see this sometimes with parents who, or even people, grandparents or babysitters who are distracted or taking a nap, and the patio door is open and a child gets out and they get into the fence and then they drown. Avoid drugs and alcohol while you're doing all of this. Again, teach your children to swim and then watch them and watch them. You cannot stress that. So here it is. What is drowning? Here's your key points. It's a common and often preventable cause of death, especially in children. People have misinformation because they're looking for these terms we no longer use. It's a process of aspiration that leads to hypoxia and eventually cardiac arrest because there's no oxygen. It doesn't mean you're going to die if we can interrupt it and hopefully get you taken care of. Patients have been rescued from drowning, have minimal symptoms. Generally, will get better within about 4 to 8 hours of the event. However, you keep an eye on them because within about 7 hours, if you're going to have problems, that's when we'll see them developing at that particular point in time.